following program is brought to you by VHB, creating results for our clients and benefits for our communities, and by Fairpoint Communications, Mechanical Services, Inc., and Volk Packaging.
Welcome to The Bottom Line. My name is Dana Connors. I am pleased to be your host for this monthly program that's brought to you by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. A program that we provide gives us an opportunity to look at some of the policies, the programs, and the people making a difference in our lives, helping to improve our bottom line. We look at the policies, the programs, the people, as I mentioned, but today we're going to add one more, that's the politics. And here to help me explore some of the policies as well as the politics of this past session, just completed in late April, are the advocacy team from the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. You've met them before, but it's my pleasure to introduce them to you again. Peter Gore, to my right, is our Vice President in charge of the advocacy team and focuses on the human resource part of our activity. To my left is Linda Caprera, who deals with the taxation issues, and to her left is Ben Gilman, who deals with our energy and environmental activities. As you can imagine, they are busy and have been busy this past session. Today we're going to take a look at the activity of this second session. It's normally characterized as the unfinished business, if you will, because there's a number of bills that gets carried over from the session. There are fewer bills, obviously, introduced into this one than the first one. For example, 500 bills in total this time compared to 2,000 in the first session. But after all, it ends up being completed in late April and not late June. We also found that in this session, even though it's a shorter one and often characterized as a quieter one, it was anything but quiet. A lot of policy, a lot of politics, and we'd like to share some of that with you in this next half hour. Let's begin by talking with our team about some of the positive things. What were some of those issues that even in the short session opened the door to help us improve the economy and helped us move our state forward? Pete, I'm going to start with you. As you think about this session and you think about some of the positive, what would come to mind? What would you like to focus on?
I think you have to look at, this was a legislature with a share of differences, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that later on. But they came to agreement, a significant agreement around changes that needed to be made to the biennial budget. As folks will remember, the legislature passed a budget last session, a biennial budget, over the objection of the governor. This session they had to come back and make adjustments to that budget through the supplemental budget process. They actually had to make 3 adjustments. And while it's always difficult to pass a biennial budget in austere fiscal times, making changes to the supplemental budget are even more difficult because you have a shortened time frame and you have less options in front of you. So they addressed the supplemental budget without increasing revenues, and they did it 3 different times, and they did it with the necessary 2/3 vote for emergency enactment in each occasion. And while they couldn't come to agreement on a lot of issues this session, it's a significant accomplishment for them to come to this 2/3 agreement on each of the 3 supplemental budget changes. But in particular, the last one, because again, the governor disagreed with the way they wanted to make the changes, the adjustments to the supplemental budget, and he vetoed that. And the legislature, who was not about to let their hard bipartisan work go to waste, they overrode that budget. And in each of the 3 occasions when they adjusted the supplemental budget, they did it without the assistance of the administration. The administration's position was, this was not our budget, this was your budget. You passed it last session, it's your problem.
And why did he veto it?
That's an interesting question. there were changes included in that he disagreed with in terms of how payments were going to be made, in particular to hospitals and some other medical providers. Enough that he stepped in with the veto pen. But the legislature said, this was our decision. This wasn't a decision that you participated in. We're okay with it, so we're going to override your veto. And again, I think that budget issues always drive the agenda in large part for the remainder of the session, for the entire session. They certainly influence what happens in the entire legislative session. And in this case, I think the legislature took their mission, their job, their responsibility to deal with the state's fiscal issues in a pretty responsible manner.
Well, and to your point, I think that we've seen in the past several biennial sessions, to be honest, that whether it's the short session where they make the adjustments or the initial budget, it has been a hallmark of every individual legislative session, the way the Appropriations Committee has worked together to deal with some pretty difficult challenges. And
this was no different.
No different. I think our hats are off to every one of them on both sides. Linda, you had a lot of activity this year.
Taxation. We had a couple different major issues. One had to do with the business equipment tax exemption. There was a bill that was initiated by the Chamber, sponsored by Ann Haskell, Senator Ann Haskell, and basically what this bill would have done was to reverse the onerous reporting requirements that were under the Betty program that were enacted in law last session. The legislature did. That basically would have required that taxpayers that were represented over 2% of the tax base of a municipality that took the Betty program would have had to supply all sorts of information in terms of income and expense data to the local assessor to properly value the property. Now, while that's great, they didn't define what the data was, so the taxpayer didn't know. They had to simply guess at what information they had to provide, and if they guessed wrong, then they lost their exemption claim. So that was really huge. It was critical that be reversed this session, and we thank Ann Haskell for doing that.
Yeah, actually, for our viewers, to your point, the business equipment tax reimbursement, which was later replaced by the exemption, business equipment tax exemption, is really a very critical program for our state, and it really meets every test that you'd like to see in an incentive, in that you've got to invest in order to get the benefit.
Exactly.
And that's often misunderstood, so it's good that this was corrected and put in its proper place, and as you said, thanking Ann Haskell was very appropriate.
Right. And the other issue was the tax expenditure review process. The legislature enacted LD 1463, which was sponsored by Peggy Rotundo of Lewiston. And basically what that does is allow OPEGA, which is a program review office, to come back to the Taxation Committee next session and develop a proposal to set forth a process to review tax expenditures that encompasses sales tax exemptions, business tax programs, really everything, charitable, governmental exemptions, anything in the sales tax. And I think it's a good idea because legislators on both sides of the aisle would like to see this. And I think it's a great idea because businesses, those programs are critical to businesses, and that just will show us how critical that they are.
I think you're absolutely
justify
right.
that.
Yeah.
So it's something that we could support in the end, and we look forward to working with the legislature next year.
That's good. Ben?
One of the true economic bright spots of the second session was the bond package that the legislature ultimately passed. It was a $50 million package broken down in 6 parts, but I think it kind of spoke to the full legislature because at the beginning of the session, if you would have asked most people, they would have said, I don't know if we're going to be able to pass a bond package this session. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in a bipartisan agreement, they were able to pass a 6-part bond package that invested heavily into our economy. And if you look at that bond package, the 6 parts of what it does, $12 million of that $50 million supports small business loans from FAME for small business startups. $10 million invests in our high-tech sector, looking at a research facility at Jackson Labs, which is a big driver in our down east economy. And another big part of it, $10 million, is the so-called water bond package. And it contemplates a couple things that I think, as we look back at this legislature, are a big deal. One, it invests in our hard infrastructure of our water treatment facilities. That's about half of it. But it also takes a new approach at looking at our water resources and invests in some conservation efforts for our headwater forests, for our natural aquifers, to preserve that for future generations. We all know water is a key issue here in the state of Maine, our quality of our water. So in that bond package, economically, looking at that water issue, I think as we look back, that's a structural change that we made to how we deal with the water bond issue here in the state of Maine. It also invests in our marine resources and our fish processing industries. It also invests in some research and development jobs.
Extremely important.
Also, so it does a lot. That $50 million, I think, was a responsible amount for this legislature. And to see them to come together at the end, in the final days of the session, I thought spoke volumes, and also it's good for our economy here as the state of Maine.
Actually, another area that received a lot of attention, and I'm pleased to say also saw progress, was in education. We saw early childhood development. That's something that business community has believed strongly in for a number of years, both in terms of financial commitment, but also creating a priority around it was very, very promising. Their investment in Jobs for Maine's graduates, the Bridge program, were all good indicators that this session, even though it received a lot of negative publicity, had some very positive, promising features to it. However, let's turn our attention for the moment to some of the things that bothered each of you that we could say the first things we've talked about helped our economy. Let's talk about those things that we either stopped or worked with others to stop that could hinder the economy. And Linda, I'm going to start with you first, because I know that you had a lot of them in taxation.
Business Equipment Tax and Reimbursement Program. We saw it on three separate occasions this year, 3 different attempts to cut that program. That program is so vital to companies in the state for investment in terms of, the economy and everything. It's really critical. In January, we saw an attempt to limit it to 12 years and eliminate retail from qualifying for the program. And there were some other provisions in the budget early on that were really troubling. In February, we saw another proposed cut to retail again, and elimination of sales tax exemption for professional services. Again, in March, we saw yet another proposed cut, proposing 10% cut on top of the 20% cut that's already in place this year.
At a time we're trying to improve our
attract
economy
companies and
attract companies
improve the economy. It's just really troubling, and I really get concerned about the message that sends to businesses in the state that have invested in good faith and have retained the important jobs we need in the state, and have tried to make strides in creating jobs as well. That message, it really troubles me that
gets
message
to the issue of predictability and consistency, which
is critical.
Important issues to the business community.
In addition, we saw a bill on tax havens. Basically, that would have labeled certain countries out there as tax havens, and potentially would have resulted in the double taxation of companies that are located in Maine that operate in those other countries.
That's one that I know we've only got a few seconds actually left before the break, and we'll get into it a little bit more after. But that's one that's misunderstood. You see, it's built on the premise that businesses are getting away with something by going overseas. And I do think that that deserves a moment of explanation. But you know what? We're going to hold that right after this break. We'll get back to that question. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Providing better transportation options, helping businesses open their doors on time, improving infrastructure, and creating innovative energy solutions. VHB has been dedicated to our Maine clients for over 30 years, and we've enjoyed partnering with our clients in Maine so much that we moved here to enhance our service delivery. If your business is looking for exceptional technical capabilities, responsive service, and a passion for excellence, contact VHB today.
Look at me. Hey.
Raymond, look at Mommy.
Maybe the light hurts his eyes.
Maybe she's just not hungry.
Maybe he can't hear us.
Maybe we're not stimulating him enough. Maybe it's a phase.
Avoiding eye contact is one early sign of autism. Learn the others today. The sooner it's diagnosed, the better.
There's a shelter pet who wants to meet you. Meet one today. Visit theshelterpetproject.org. Adopt.
You're watching Time Warner Cable Community.
Welcome back. My name is Dana Connors, and I'm pleased to have my advocacy team here with me today, Peter Gore, Linda Caprera, and Ben Gilman. And we're going to pick up with where we left off, in that we're going to discuss a little bit the concept of tax havens. The very name denotes that it's something that somebody's getting away with, not paying their fair share. Linda, can you help our viewers to understand that's not the case at all?
It's not the case. I mean, a lot of companies operate in various countries around the world. I mean, it's truly a global economy today. And when they operate in these other countries, they do it for various reasons. They may have subsidiaries that have nothing to do with operations in the U.S. here. They may have a totally different business focus. They may try to attract market share in these various countries. There may be locational issues why they operate in countries. So it's not to avoid taxation. I mean, are there bad actors out there? There probably is. But that doesn't mean everybody that operates in these other countries are doing that to avoid taxation. And there's, on the federal level, there's ways of dealing with people who don't pay their fair share of taxation.
And in the previous segment, you did mention it is double taxation, so it's a constitutional question.
It's absolutely a constitutional question, and that was raised this session in the committee. It was raised that there is a potential constitutionality issue with the Maine Revenue Services. They raised that issue.
Also in the area of misunderstanding, when you think of mining, that clearly is one that we're looking at through the lens of years gone by, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the true economic development opportunities I think that was lost during this legislative session was the adoption of the mining rules. In Maine, we have very restrictive rules for mining. It's been a zero growth industry because we haven't seen any mining in Maine for more than 25 years. This legislature had an opportunity to change that. There were some draft mining rules that changed that, but also protected our most natural resources, which help some areas in the state that truly could use it. Rural areas of the state, one site up in northern Maine, potentially be upwards of 700 jobs. And unfortunately, politics got involved with the mining bill, and it wasn't successful at the end of the day. But the fact is, metals are part of our lives. We all have metals. We use them every day. And a lot of those metals come from parts of the world that don't have regulations.
Exactly.
And the way they do it in some of these third world countries are really disturbing practices. And we had an opportunity here in the state of Maine to not only show the United States, but to show the world that mining can be done. It can be done responsibly. And we have some significant deposits here in the state. But as I said earlier, unfortunately, politics gets involved when you start talking about mining issues, and that's what occurred early on during this legislative session. So when it came to the adoption of those mining rules, not only did we say no to the adoption and an opportunity here in the state, it actually went a step further, and there was a proposal to actually put a moratorium on mining for a couple of years here in the state of Maine. That bill was actually vetoed by the governor and sustained. So it actually went in the opposite direction. But going into this session, they faced a significant economic development opportunity, and it's unfortunate that it got punted to future years.
Yeah, and fear does sell in the world we live in.
It does, and when you bring examples from out of state or other states that weren't really part of the mining proposal here, it does sell through fear.
Hey, Pete, we mentioned in an earlier section that we deal with measures that either help the economy or hinder it, but we also fear the message that goes out when legislation even gets discussed and debated and gets into the headlines that talks about what we're doing that can stand in the way of progress. You had workers' comp, which is an issue. You had minimum wage, but you also had one that fit that definition very well, and that was the call center that would send a chilling message to anybody looking to us. Can you share with us what your concern was with that, or what our concern was?
Well, if the bill had passed, it would have effectively put an end to ever having another call center located in Maine. And those that were here would probably, try and get out of town as quickly as possible before the bill became a law. But essentially, if you were a call center located in the state, or you had a back office, a defined back office of your company, operating here in a sort of a call center office manner, and you decided to relocate that to a different country. It could be Canada, it could be Mexico, but a different country, then if you had received any kind of business incentives, which Linda had talked about, you would have been required to pay back a portion, amortized portion of that to the state. You would be barred for 5 years, a period of 5 years, from being eligible for those incentives again. And then if you didn't give proper notice, you faced a fine of, God, I think it was $10,000 a day, and it might have been more. And so, obviously, the bill was it was knocked around in the LCRED committee. It had limited support initially in committee and in the legislature. Bill sponsor fought to try and keep the bill alive, offered some amendments. Ultimately, it died on the appropriations table, where it ended up facing some significant opposition down there, and it never got up to the full body for final enactment. It was enacted in the House, but not in the Senate. It just, the issue here is, and we've all heard it this session when we talk about problems, is legislators said, well, it doesn't really matter because this bill is going to be vetoed by the governor anyway, so what difference does it make? And to your point, as you introduced my segment, and that is, it sent a very troubling message outside of the state. The legislature was willing to enact a kind of egregious bill like this that that said to the business community, okay, today, for instance, it's call centers. Who's it going to be next? Because if you pick one business, you're going to pick another business.
Right.
So.
I mean, we saw that with the tax haven bill. I mean, we got calls from, embassies down in Washington that were concerned about, federal, trade implications with that, and it's huge.
Yeah, it is. It's a dampening effect. Ben?
It's an election year, though. I think we all have to be cognizant of that.
Right.
And a lot of this jockeying going on, we see it during the second session, but this session was a little bit more so. The
Absolutely.
gubernatorial election split.
A lot at stake, House, Senate,
Well,
Governor.
let's put that in context, because I think that's the point we want to end on. We've talked about the policies, but politics has such an influence this session. We're used to the noise, but maybe not the volume that we saw this year. And frankly, I don't recall in my experience the contention, if you will, the discontent between the second floor of the governor's office and the third floor. How many times have we seen the occasion where a governor didn't participate in the budget, but ended up vetoing the budget, only to be overridden, which brings you to the point of not only the number of vetoes, but the number of bills that were passed that you've talked about here without his signature, and yet the governor is the one that we went to, which I'm reminded of in your last comment, that we went to so many times to stop legislation that we fought in the first place, and we depended on his veto to help the situation. Put all of that into context. What would your reaction to what I just said be, other than what just happened? I mean, that is a confusing, not an ordinary set of circumstances. What do you make of that?
That it's an election year. I mean,
steroids.
yeah, I mean, it is. And well, there were certainly some things that were accomplished this session, and we've talked about some of those accomplishments. You can't help but looking at this legislature and chief executive and saying, there were some lost opportunities, some things that could have got done that didn't get done. And so, and part of that is, I mean, I think that, as you indicated, everybody was trying to score election year points in their policy, in what they were putting out, how they were voting, what the message was. So there was more messaging than policy in a lot of instances, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, at certain policy points, they were able to rise above it when it was important. The bond package, the budget, some of the taxation issues. But when it came down to brass tacks on simply making a political point, the call center bill, they're looking forward to the November election. And they're not concerned about the message that is seen from outside of the state, because they know the end result is the legislation likely isn't going to be passed, which makes it difficult to operate as well. But, I mean, really, I think when you get down to the brass tacks, if it was a political issue, we saw it get tied up in the politics, but some policy was able to rise above that during the second session, and I think we talked about that earlier.
So, you often hear, and we believe it, that so much gets done through being able to work together and to get the job done, and that compromise is always a part of, or part of most solutions. And yet, in this instance, we were witness to a governor who submitted a bill who ended up vetoing it because it wasn't exactly the way it was. So this was really a session that you saw only in rare instances was there a lot of compromise. I mean, the Appropriations Committee was clearly one of those that, And the things that we saw progress on, you saw some of it. But more often than not, things did not advance because there was that unwillingness or inability. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was unwillingness to work together.
And I think it's a disturbing trend, and regardless of what happens in the next election, that really has to change. There has to be more of an opportunity, more of a willingness to find some level of compromise between the different philosophies.
Well, do you know of any candidate that, or very few that are running today, that don't put forth their efforts around that very premise?
Right.
Then to get things done, we've got to work together, that it's more than about me. So I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, mining was a perfect example. Early on in the session, both sides got into their corner, and there wasn't going to be a compromise or working together. And one of the issues I think I'm going to bring up, it's not as popular to say, but term limits.
Yeah.
You know, when people have been around for a while, they can kind of see through that at times. But I think when you have folks that, you know, I think in this session, majority of the legislature are either in their first or second term. So some of these election year issues that we've seen come up in the past are new to them. It's nothing against them, but when you have 60% of the body is, you know, less than 4 years experience, that's something to think about.
I got 30 seconds to wrap this segment up, and I think that we all acknowledge that this was a session that we saw some very good things advance. It was a little overshadowed by the contention, the controversy, the challenges, the political year that we're in, perhaps to a higher volume than we've been witness to in the past, but it was there. But in spite of that, there were some very positive things, and that gives us hope, and I think we need to accentuate that even more as we go forward. That actually is our bottom line for this month. We hope we've given you a glimpse into this session, the second session of the 126, both the policy as well as the politics. I want to remind you that what you've been witness to today is our opinion, our perspective. It's not everyone's opinion, nor is it everyone's perspective. We've also shared only some of the issues, not all of the issues, but they were priority issues to us as we saw them helping to improve our economy. What about you? I know of the 500 bills that were discussed, debated, and disposed of one way or another. Many of those you have interest in, and most of those impact you one way or another. You know, this is the absolute best time possible, if you are interested in any of those, and I know that you must be, to take advantage of the political season that we're a part of. Between now and November, there's a tremendous opportunity. Reach out to your candidates. All 186 legislators are up for election. Your governor, the bond issue. This is a wonderful time. Get involved, ask your questions, seek your answers. If there are ways that we can help bring forward issues, we'll do that. But most of all, exercise your right to vote when the time comes. It makes a difference. It really does matter. That's our program for this month. We thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. In the meantime, have a wonderful summer. Enjoy it right here in Maine. There is no better place. With that, I wish you well and good day. Thank you.